I am a photographer, an artist, and a teacher, and I have had the good fortune of teaching the last 4 days a very small group of 11 middle school through high school kids. And we've been talking about empathy and photography, which relates, I think, pretty specifically to this body of work. A lot of what I was talking to my students about relates back to the experience I had working with Rhonda to make this series of portraits. So when I am talking with students, when we're talking about photography and representation, we start talking about language, and we talk about the language we use for making photographs, which at this point comes up with shoot, capture, and take, which are all kind of aggressive vocabularies. And I think folks are starting to pay more and more attention to that language and make more deliberate choices about the words that they're using, especially because of some parts of photography's elusive past. So I ask students the same things I try to ask of myself, which is to be considerate of your approach. And I find these two approaches to be in contradiction and contrast with each other. There's the Steve McCurry vibe of your camera being your passport, which I think is dangerous when it goes unchecked. Your camera isn't necessarily your entree to any culture or any territory or any place or space, and I'm seeing lots of nods, so I'm preaching to the choir here, which is great. And I found the work and an artist talk by Bethany Mollenkoff through Photofilm, which is United Photo Industries. She's got some great content online and it's really interesting perspectives. And she also talks about her camera as being licensed, but she talks about it in the context of her curiosity and her interest in connecting and learning. And you can see this palpable excitement build in her, just her body and her spirit as she's talking about the opportunities to meet people and to make these connections and to share stories rather than to come in and be an observer and blanket tell stories, which I think sometimes photographers in the past have had a problem with, coming in and asserting their influence over a scene or over a subject. And more, thankfully, that's becoming questioned and it's being looked at more critically. So that part is good. And I will say that in working with students, I am very heartened that they are aware of things like exploitation and consent and engagement and wanting to really work with their subjects, and they have a real sense of being a guest and how one gets access to subjects. And I'm grateful that more and more of those conversations are being had, and I think it's really important, especially because of how much access students have or young people have to images, right? They're looking at images all the time. And as a side note, I'm always noticing their intuitive sense of composition is amazing. I teach adults who are good and have a great sense of composition and can really learn composition, but I'm finding more and more that kids who may not be able to use the vocabulary around composition know what makes a good photograph because they know what stops them in their tracks. So that part is really interesting for me as a photographer and a teacher of kiddos. So in taking on this project, I definitely had a conversation with myself about, was I the right person for this job? I don't know that I was the right person. I was a right person. And it came down to the fact that in an ideal and perfect situation, I think Rhonda would have loved to have had a native photographer, but that was not a possibility. But I also have come to feel really comfortable with the idea that our community needed this exhibition at the time, and so it was a real privilege and an honor for me to be able to help get Rhonda's vision onto the walls and have these portraits made. So, in talking to my students and thinking about making photographs when you are an outsider to a cultural group, these are just some basic questions that seem like good things to concentrate on and to think about and to ask yourself. So, are you reacting, or are you actually listening and responding to your subjects and to what's in front of you? Have you considered what's important to you versus what's important to your subject and your collaborator? So really trying to make it a true collaboration as opposed to asserting your influence on a given situation. In a lot of situations, that may not be so important. You know, if it's a situation where you're creating a fine art document and it is about your influence and your perspective and your point of view, that's a different thing. But in this instance, what I'm talking about is, you know, being an outsider to like a cultural group or a person from a different background than you. What kind of considerations do you want to make? I also think it's important to pay attention to your own biases and judgments. Documentary photographers are always trying to have an unbiased approach. I'm not so sure that's ever really possible. You're constantly making decisions when you're looking through the frame of your camera. And so those unconscious biases really need to be paid attention to, and we need to be thoughtful about where we come from and what we've experienced and how that might seep into our work and the images that we make. And when we make work, I think it's part of our responsibility, especially if we're trying to ethically and empathetically represent other folks, then where can we get reliable feedback about whether or not what we're doing is just and fair and representative. So the other pieces that came up was what might you want to know about who or what you're photographing before you start photographing. And so in this case, I have a bit of a background in photography and photographic history, so knowing the historical misrepresentation of Native Americans was really important to thinking about and planning how Rhonda and I approached making these portraits, because we wanted folks to have agency, complete agency over where and how they were photographed, because of the ways in which historically Native people have been removed from their environments, photographed in isolated ways, and because of the research that's been done that shows that these misrepresentations can really impact your health and wellness. And that's part of the reason that the mascot issue is so important, because it is impacting Native Americans and particularly Native American youth, which Rhonda will talk to you more about momentarily. Most famously, Edward Curtis proliferated our world with images just after the turn of the century, and created this very complete portfolio that gave everyone the impression that the Native American people were a vanishing race, and essentially were going to be moving on into the shadowy distance, which was not fair, and then influenced this kind of a strange backlash, was that it created this opening for Native American imagery and motifs to come up in our social and cultural day-to-day life. You know, it started to pop up on all the advertising and imagery, and again, I think you're going to touch on that somewhere too. So the misrepresentation had continuing echoes and effects, and continuing to this day. The image on the right is the cover of a book that was created, I'm making the photographer nameless, but out of respect for the photographer, they did also go back after receiving some backlash for choosing before they pass away to define the work that they were doing on different tribal cultures around the world, and then making it a homage to humanity. So folks are paying more attention and being more critical and making better decisions, and that part is great. And so I'm always trying to find the positive and move forward. The other really great thing is that there are lots of Native American and Indigenous photographers who are getting a lot of what's the word I'm looking for?
Visibility.
Say that again?
Visibility.
Visibility, thank you, yes. Yes, a lot more visibility. Their work is coming to the forefront, which is fantastic. Latika Wilbur's project called Project 562 she's trying to document members of every recognized tribal group in the United States, which now numbers 573.
It changes, but that's also a little problematic because she's only photographing federally recognized, which is 562 to 570.
Okay, all right. And I think she keeps the name for continuity and consistency. And as we know, I mean, these things are complicated, but it's a really beautiful series, and she's got a podcast and is a really interesting person to listen to and hear about and to look at her portraits. And I think what also is good for those of us that don't have a sense of how diverse and how broadly dispersed the Native people are, Native Americans are in our country. Will Wilson is working to supplant Curtis's secular gaze by creating a series of portraits of artists and professionals, and I think he works out of Santa Fe and is using vintage forms of photography, wet plate photography, to create these beautiful portraits. Josue Rivas was finally an indigenous voice that made it to Standing Rock, and up until, I believe, up until he arrived, most of the documentation was coming from non-native folks, and he kept getting Instagram messages and messages from friends like, we need you have to come, we need an indigenous voice to come and represent and take images, and so thankfully his work has come to the top of the heap in terms of representing the experience at the studio. Wendy Red Star's work, her reimagining and re-envisioning of some of Reinhardt's work and other early turn-of-the-century photographs where she's gone in and annotated these portraits that have been removed from any context. She goes back in and adds context and provides information about the ceremonial regalia, the important parts, and the pieces that are significant to different tribes and folks that are represented in the photographs. So kind of a reclaiming. And her work, I think, is still at the Kids Space at Mass MoCA, and she's also being collected at Lyons College of Art. So I think you can see her in Western Mass, or work at least. So in closing, I sneak this in as a request to just continue listening. This photograph is one of Rhonda and my favorite photograph. You will notice it is not the photograph on the wall, because the conversation needs to continue and the listening needs to continue, and that's how we keep the collaborations going and the engagement between outsiders and insiders, hopefully on a positive bent. So had the honor of photographing Anthony Melting-Tallow, and in these photo sessions, there was lots of conversation and lots of getting to know each other. And in this moment, Anthony was talking about meeting one of his idols at a march on Washington, and this just incredible moment of when he met her and was able to stand before her. And I, as photographer, was like, I got my decisive moment, look at this, I love it, he's so expressive. But to be fair, in retrospect, this is not the way you would encounter Anthony on a regular basis. He is much more reserved, he is much more resolved, and how would you describe him?
I don't know, this is how I encounter him all the time, so, but that's not how he wanted to be represented.
Yeah, and at the
So
end
we
of the
had to
day,
listen to that.
right, at the end of the day, that is, he was not comfortable with the photograph, and therefore the photograph is not the one that you see on the wall.
And I was there when
Yeah.
when we walked into the TV. Oh my God, it's Space Final!
And in retrospect, I think both Rhonda and I had a moment of disappointment, and in retrospect, obviously for me, wanting to honor his wishes in the way that he wanted to be represented was paramount. And I've come to really appreciate this portrait. It shows a little bit more of his environment and some other different pieces about the way the gesture of his hand. And so, it just goes to show you that your opinion may not always be the most important one, and that is a valuable lesson to carry with you. So, I think we're gonna just go to Rhonda, and I'm happy to answer any questions later, the two of us. And so, thank you for your attention and time. Go ahead, Steve. You're good. All right.
Let's pull this up for you. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
And then we have, let's see,
Here, yep.
screen. Use this or thank you.
We have the queasy thing. I'm probably just gonna sit. Oh, I think I can see everyone. Really chill here. So, pagalagirsi, umalami, tamakshinaga magaba aniga Rhonda Anderson, unubiakshinaga alak, pamakapalurama korinami, Kaptobeg Minahorana, Fairbanks Minahorana, Shabakdunga, Western Massachusetts Commissioner on Indian Affairs, Shabakdunga, founder and co-director of Okateo Cultural Center, and the Native Youth Empowerment Foundation. So, Koyunok Naga Nagisi. Thank you for listening. Thank you for coming out. Really, I appreciate each one of you. Thank you so much. And thank you to Vermont Center for Photography for having us. I really appreciate this beautiful space and really highlighting these photographs. It means a lot to me. I greeted you traditionally in my Inupiat language, and I'll talk a little bit about myself because people always ask questions, and I usually get like, were you born in an igloo? Kind of questions, which that's real. I'm not making a joke of it. It happens. I am Inupiaq Athabascan from Alaska, and my native enrollment village is Kaptowik, which is way up there. And the demarcation of Canada and Alaska on the Beaufort Sea, and it is the only village that's in Area 1002, which is set aside. That was set aside by Carter for petroleum exploration. And it very recently, through the tax bill in 2017, got reopened, and we had spent a number of years scrambling to try to close it back down again. We're the only village that's in this area, so it would be very problematic. Most of my family depends on hunting, fishing, and whaling for food. It is a whaling village, as seen in the picture. The whole community turns out. Whaling happens twice a year. And twice a year, there's also more polar bears than humans in my village, which is kind of a neat thing. My Akka, my grandmother, she was the youngest of 12. She's the little bitty one sitting in her sister Nora's lap. She's the youngest by 14 years. So she was kind of one of those, oh, this still works. We can still have kids. So she grew up in a clapboard house, kind of like what you'd see here, 2-room house, but what's different is 22 people lived in that house. This is my great-grandmother and her sister, who's my namesake, Egyak and Alak. Alak is my namesake. And my Ariga, my grandfather, Johnny, he was born in Flat, Alaska, which is also known as Nome. He went to residential school when, he was young. He was taken from his family and brought to a residential school. And residential schools are really traumatic. It was a government policy, really, to forcibly remove children and forcibly remove languages, culture, and a sense of identity and self. Needless to say, he didn't last very long there. He stayed until he was 16 and quit. And he became one of the first, he became a bush pilot first, and then he became one of the first commercial pilots for Pan Am Airlines. It was Wien Airlines at the time. And he flew the first flight into Reykjavik, and he did a loop-de-loop with a passenger jet. And all the Pan Am officials were like, freaking out. Anyway, so yeah, he did go to residential school at Naplutna, and a little context there is those schools, as I said, were a policy of intentional genocide, intentional cultural genocide, and the motto was to kill the Indian and save the man. So he left. My grandmother only made it to second grade because she didn't like it either, and she had a big family to fall back on, so she was able to go back home. My dad, here's a picture of my dad and I. He also was born in Fairbanks, and he grew up living a life everyone could recognize from down here, lots of Boy Scouts and baseball and tons of college, way too much college. And I think I kind of want to get this out of the way, right? Because I get this question a lot, is what do I call you? Are you Native American? Are you Indian? Like, what is the right term? And I usually answer that by sort of paraphrasing a story from a late great comedian and author, Jim Northrup. And he said, when he was in elementary school, he was taught he was an Indian. And when he went to high school, he learned that he was Native American. In college, he studied and found he's indigenous. But it wasn't until he went back home to his community that he understood that he's a Anishinaabe. So using that logic, I hope that it's kind of clear. Native American is in reference to Turtle Island after colonization and referencing the current form of government. So natives were here long before the United States government, right? Indian, that was a mistake by Columbus. He was kind of lost. It got stuck. We own it, but that's it. Don't think it should be used anywhere else. First Nations is kind of acceptable, Indigenous acceptable, but what is the most acceptable is using the nation that you're from. So if you know someone's nation, that's who they are. That's how we identify. Our tribal identity is the most appropriate way. As Indigenous people, I'm going to talk about representation because that's why these photographs happen. As Indigenous people, we make up less than 2% of the population in the United States, right? But where's the representation? When was the last time you saw a movie or a TV show or turned on the radio and heard Native music? Well, you can turn it on now and you can hear my commercials, but when was the last time? Like it just doesn't happen. And if you can recall a movie, was it a protagonist role? Was that role like in history, contemporary? Was it a stereotypical role? How are we represented? Was it just everyday life, like just an Indian family buying Doritos or something? Like it doesn't happen. We are everywhere. Our images are everywhere. On the sides of helmets, on bags of flour, on cigarette packs. My cousin is on the tail of the airplane. But those are not representations. Those are not our doing. So can you like imagine for a moment why that might happen? Right? Why does this happen? Why are these images everywhere but they're not our making? This happens because the story is told from one side, and it's done in a way that makes the history more palatable, much more easier to deal with. We kind of have to, as the society today, we have to invisibilize Indigenous people to make the history more comfortable. I paraphrase a quote from Tuck and Ree, and they have a great decolonization platform. The quote is, "In order for the settlers to make a place their home, they must destroy and disappear the Indigenous peoples that live there. For the settlers, Indigenous peoples are in the way. And in the destruction of Indigenous peoples, the land is recast as property and as a resource. Indigenous people must be erased and must be made into ghosts," end quote. So this is what we're dealing with. The very foundations of this country is working towards making Indigenous people invisible. So I'm going to back up a bit to 1620. Part of the problem goes back quite a ways. If you can look on here, right there. I hopped a big loogie on that. Much to the dismay of some of the people around me, and other people were cheering, and some people were like, "Oh!" But this problem goes back, 1620 more, even. How exactly does a settler lens erase Indigenous people? This is a great way. So I kind of want you to see the eyes of an Indigenous, see through the eyes of an Indigenous person. What do I see living here in this part of New England, right? I only live like 25 minutes down the road from here, so I'm local. But I see this educational system that really kind of upholds these colonizer myths of the perfect Thanksgiving or the Plymouth Rock. That's a myth, you know? And it does a really great job of erasing Indigenous narratives of thousands of years. But I wanted to start there because I feel like it's important to understand that this starts in school, how we're taught. And schools really kind of use that settler lens on multiple fronts. It's an intentional erasure. And ultimately, like a disappearance of our existence. I mean, we live in an area where there's all of these plaques everywhere. They're commemorating colonizers. They're referencing natives as Indians and savages and the attackers. You know, Indians, as I said before, that erases the identity of the people that were here. That wasn't Indians. These are Nipmuc and Pakuntuk and Norwadek and Orinoco and Abenaki. These aren't just Indians. So these memorials are erected to honor the colonists. I love this vocabulary. Imperialist nostalgia for patriotism and sacrifice, and give like this justification to genocide. It's justifying the genocide that happened because the Indians attacked. Anthropologist Renato Rosaldo describes imperialist nostalgia as a mood of nostalgia that makes racial domination appear innocent and pure. It's a people that are mourning the passing or a transformation of something that they caused to be transformed. This form of erasure is a painful reminder that we just are not important enough to remember. And of course, I don't know how many of you know the Mohawk Trail, Route 2. I bring this up because it's right down the road. Clinton Hugh Richmond coined the name Mohawk Trail in 1913, greatly exaggerating Mohawk's influence in this area. I mean, I think Mohawk, there were like 200 some odd miles to the northwest of here. They hardly ever came through here. There was a lot of other communities that were here. But this Mohawk Trail today, you can see these cultural appropriations, these stereotypes that continue to exist, and they represent absolutely no one that I know of. I mean, I don't look like this. But this statue informs me of what I'm supposed to look like, who I'm supposed to be. And driving every day and seeing that is a form of violence. This one's my favorite. So on the Mohawk Trail, I can't think of a more culturally appropriated cluster of misinformation. That's being nice. So this fully participates in erasure. And Mass DOT highlights this statue on every single scenic signpost highway sign for 100 miles. It's ridiculous. So do you know who made this statue? Who erected it? Okay, get a load of this. The Improved Order of the Red Men. Yeah, the Improved Order of the Red Men had, if you wanted to join their club, you had to be white, and then you were given a native name, and it could be Pocahontas or Sacagawea or, any random name. And then you belonged to the club, which was a tribe name. And so around this looking pool up here, they have all of these plaques saying that this was erected by the Nipmuc. Well, that's really confusing because the Nipmuc had absolutely nothing to do with this. But this statue, done by the Improved Order of the Red Men, was in memory of the Mohawk tribe, which, they're still here. They're not ghosts. They're still here. So it's a very confusing piece for people to come and look at. The prevailing mainstream attitude right here is that we were all wiped off the continent. And this piece totally makes you feel it when you see it. It's so not true. It totally invisibilizes us.
Decent roadside stop.
Right? Right?
Just a decent little stop.
I did a talk on this about erasure through plaques and whatnot very recently through Okateo, my cultural center, and a woman was like, "I'm devastated. I thought it was real." No, it's not real. But this kind of education still happens. So this was in 2012 at my daughter's school, Coleraine Central School, which is maybe 15 miles from here. The elementary school and the other schools in the district use these books to teach their 3rd grade class. And these were being taught as nonfiction. And when you're in 3rd grade, you have absolutely very little idea about, it's black and white, it's truth or not truth. And so they have very little idea how to be subjective about these books. And the vocabulary that came home was heathen, squaw, savage, all of these lovely pejoratives that I would rather my daughter not have. And then the test came home, and that was Indians are savages. And I can see she scribbled out here, and I asked her about this, and she said, "What made you think to write this?" And she said, "Well, I had a hard time using savage in this sentence, so I asked my teacher, and my teacher said Indians are savages." So she wrote it down on her test. She did not capitalize the I in Indians, so she had to erase it, and then it was marked, "Well done." You can imagine I flipped out just a little bit when this came home. It had some serious repercussions. Her friends were sitting at our dinner table, and they said that Nana's not native because she doesn't eat human meat off the bone, and she's not a heathen savage. I had to show pictures and remind them that last year in school they said "Uwalalatak" every day, which means good day. And that's our language, and that's a native language. And they said, nah, she's not a heathen. She lost trust in her teachers, and she's having a hard time still trusting her teachers. It had really lasting repercussions. There's plenty of good books out there in the world that could be used, and these three are not it. But the elementary schools that participate in this kind of education, like it's furthered when mascots are being used, right? This is, both of these are schools I went to. I went to Mohawk Trail Regional High School, which is like wrong on so many levels, right? We talked about Mohawk really weren't there, et cetera, plus this image on the back is just not all that great. And Turner's Falls Indians, that also was kind of rude. Captain Turner murdered the native population that was camping there peacefully. So I've been a long-time activist on removing mascots since the late 1990s with Frontier Regional High School and the R-Skins. I worked a very long time with Turner's Falls High School. We saw that change happen February 14th of 2017. I'll never forget it. All of us who wanted change, we wore red. And it was beautiful. Mohawk Trail Regional High School is still grappling with their responsibility. They kind of know they have to change, but the community doesn't want to let it go because it's a tradition kind of a thing. I'm hoping that they realize they have more work to do. But using this kind of imagery in schools, it erases the identity of Native people, right? It makes a stereotype and a bias of what a Native person is supposed to look like, portrays us as savage and warrior-like in the past, right? It makes Native people feel unsafe going to a game or going to school even. That's a civil rights violation. Non-Native people are left with these images, and like the cartoon says, really? You don't look like an Indian? Because all the images that this kid sees are on the side of the helmet or, Disneyfied, not our making, not who we are. So the use of these mascots, they are green-lighted throughout communities. It doesn't just stay at the school, it moves out into the community. And that's evidenced here by the newspaper headlines, Indians invade and town braces for Indian attack. Plus the obligatory kid wearing the full fake headdress. This was during the time that we were asking them to change. And they said, we're not doing anything that's culturally appropriative. We're just honoring you. And then they go and do this. So because of that, I would say that we're probably the last accepted vestige of overt racism in this country. Right? I would go so far as to say celebrated racism. Dressing up as a Pocahontas. The most mainstream images of us, people tend to think that we're ignorant, drunk savages, or this Pocahontas image. Yeah, these are really swift. And that's not okay, because that representation really boils down to what most people think versus the truth. That Disneyfied princess image versus the real struggles that we face as Indigenous people upholding our tribal sovereignties and our Indigenous rights. Right? So these are pictures from Standing Rock. I figure if somebody's going to dress up as a Pocahontas, I may as well spray them in the face with some mace so they can have a full experience. Right? I can't accept it. But that's really an important thing, because understanding how these images affect us. Our women are 10 times more likely to be sexually assaulted, to face murder, to face domestic violence than any other race in this country, 10 times higher. Native teenagers have the highest rate of suicide. 74% of deaths between the age of 10 and 24 are suicide and rising. These were outdated 2019 numbers. Native men have the highest rates of incarceration and death from police brutality. It's 4 times higher than than the next race. So what the school system teaches us and what we see, those myths, they have real implications. They create stereotypes, they create biases. It dramatically affects our outcomes. This picture, Ryan Redhawk or Ryan Visions, it's been said, and I'd have to verify for sure, but this teenage girl, she's 17 in this picture, committed suicide months after this photo was taken. So there needs to be an understanding how that rise of mascots, that rise of that imagery happened when Native children were being removed from their homes and their culture being taken away. Non-Native people during that time, late 1800s, early 1900s, were trying to figure out who they are and identity in this melting pot country. And so they chose to honor, through imperialist nationalism, right? They chose to honor the fallen warrior, the noble savage, and giving nod, really, to manifest destiny. That really began to control who had control over our identity. We are the only race that is used for mascots, right alongside animals. There's chosen professions, right? You can choose to be a cowboy, you can choose to be a patriot. You can't choose to be an Indian. Races that are not oppressed minorities, like Vikings are not oppressed today, and if they are oppressed and they feel something, then they should mention something. Or imaginary beings. A leprechaun is an imaginary being. If Irish folks are feeling some kind of way about it, then they should say something. Yeah, but I don't want to ring you, dude. As a Native woman, right, I found it's really dangerous to speak up. If you Google my name and mascots, that's the picture you're going to get. I look mad, right? I mean, what do I look like? You know what? I'm having a relaxed conversation and I'm saying, these are the people you need to invite to the table. When you're talking about a mascot, you need to ask the Nipmuc, the Abenaki, the Mohican. These are the people that need to be at the table. That's what I was saying. I wasn't mad. I was actually having a pleasant conversation. But that image sells. That's not okay. I'm a member of the Mass Mascot Coalition and the Mass Indigenous Agenda, and we have changed well over 20 schools since 2019. So it's been happening. It's getting a little slower now because the holdouts are there. But every school that has changed so far, they're changing to be on the right side of history. They're understanding why they need to change. And I've been really public about, that this needs to happen, that this is a civil rights violation. And I work really closely with legislators to try to get our mascot bill passed. I see up here in Rutland, Vermont, they dropped the slur name, and then, went back, they got a whole new school board, and now they're going to go back to the slur name. Well, that's why a bill is important, because it mandates that they cannot go back. People have a hard time getting rid of their mascots and their imagery. Through my job at Okateo, I curate and moderate a panel on Indigenous identity through mascotry. I also had a well-respected scholar who's done decades, collected decades of empirical evidence on the harm, and she's very well published and amazing. But here we are. One, as I've said in my curator statement, was one good thing about this mascot controversy is that it allows us to learn, it allows us to grow, it allows us to hear from a different point of view, right? It enables a closer inspection of how we see and how we treat other human beings. And during those recent debates about mascots and, man, we heard the same thing over and over again. It was like, Native people are just a part of history. And if we don't have these images, then you're gone. Like somehow a mascot was going to be educating the students instead of creating relationships with the actual indigenous community in that area. So there was a need, a real need for accurate representation that wasn't like dehumanizing or a caricature or putting us in the past, reducing us to these ridiculous stereotypes. And again, like I said, we're really invisible in mainstream society. So that was another important part about that. I remember I was sitting with Linda McInerney, who's not in this picture, of Egg Tooth Productions. And Linda told me she wanted to make a documentary about me and my struggle getting Turner's Falls High School to change. And I was like, no, you can't focus on one person. This issue affects 50,000 Native people living in the state of Massachusetts. And so I was not comfortable having this issue just like centered on me, just one person, but I knew it had to be a wider lens, to coin a phrase, right? I needed to have all different kinds of Native folks that were living in our area. So my idea was to facilitate this, this art installation and kind of lift our identity and have many different people from the area make their faces, their voices, their very humanness, like here, part of public consciousness. And again, like Sara was saying, I was guided by this work by Matika Wilbur and Josu Rivas and Brian Adams. And their work really brings agency and identity and contemporary issues to the forefront. And their work really challenges this dominant narrative. And doing this work brings an indigenous-led narrative, which is super important. So in that spirit of agency over identity, I asked participants to choose that location or that happy place that was meaningful to them. I made sure that they had agency of how they were represented. I even went in, see, look how I am. I went in Johnny Cash style, like wearing black. I almost wore an identical t-shirt to Nia's. Nia was our first. And as I was putting on that t-shirt, I was like, I don't want to have anything inform our subjects of how they need to be themselves. And so she wore that t-shirt, and I was like, yay! I did tell our participants that this is like basically what I went through. Like, we just went through a horrific mascot ordeal, and our identity is being challenged, so we need to have this portraiture. Would you like to be in it? That's pretty much how we framed it, right? Like, I don't think we let on too much, but this is why we're doing it. So, I learned a lot, like Sara was saying, learning how to listen, and trying to get it right. And I feel like one of the things I learned was that most of the people wanted to be outside. And you know, I was expecting something different. I was expecting libraries or video games or, you know, sitting in front of a computer or, you know, next to a car, like, you know, trappings of the 21st century or something. No. I think most of our subjects really wanted to be outside. And so that goes back to the very beginning when I was talking about our identity and how most of our tribal identity is a place-based, land-based, and we feel more connected to the land, no matter where we are. I'm from Alaska, but I feel really connected here. Some of these portraits from California, you know, way other places, but they feel very connected here and want to be outside. This is their continent. I did ask for each of their participants to write a statement. Some were very short, you know. I'm so-and-so, so-and-so nation, that's it. And some went on a tangent, and that was great. I wanted to allow as much agency as someone needed to talk about whatever they needed to talk about. Give them that platform, that visibility. And I think that that was also super important. I didn't tell people what to write. Some people would ask me, what should I write about? And I would say, whatever you want to talk about. What issue is important to you? You know, bonus points if we talk about mascots, but but I feel like for the most part, I allowed for as much space as people needed to talk about what was important to them. You know, I really wanted people to see that we are who we are in society today. We're teachers, we're professors, we're lawyers, we're doctors, we're commissioners on Indian Affairs. We are all kinds of different people living here among you. And so we really wanted to like show that. So thank you for listening. A little crowd today. Thank you so much. You made it through the whole thing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And for the record, this will be going on, so you can share it with the masses, and we'll, you know, internet these days reaches more people than anything. But does anybody have any fleeting, pressing thoughts, questions, observations, feelings that they want to mention?
Glad you're doing the work. It's important work. It's a long road. It's a
It
long road.
is.
Or are misguided for decades, generations, and change is difficult for some people, but it's not misguided what you're doing at all. Not at all. That picture says it all. That's it. Stand up and do the right thing. Thank you for sharing it.
Thank you for listening. Like, I think that's where everything really, the work gets done. It's just listening. You know, you can reach across the aisle and speak to humanity. Both parties are willing to listen.
Thank you.
I mean, they're stunning. And you know, as a kid, I came from a culture of having portraits being like a very like special like thing that happened. My brother, my sister, older than me, they had their portraits. And I remember when it was my turn to have my portrait done, and I was so upset my mother put me in this dress I hated. She made me hold this stuffed animal that I didn't like. And it was really hard as a kid, and I really like that experience. I look at these and I think of that experience, and I think it's just so wonderful that they got to really choose how they were represented and how they like. Because I think that it's really special.
My daughter, who now doesn't like her photo, but that's too bad because we're keeping it. She's the young girl holding a chicken in her bedroom. She wanted lights. She wanted a chicken. All of her stuffed animals around her.
Disco ball.
Oh, the disco ball is going for sure. Yeah. Oh, she wanted it. She wanted it all because that was her. That was her moment. She really loved it. But now she's 18 and like, oh my God, that was so like 3 years ago.
Well, I think as she gets
Do it
older, she'll
again.
appreciate it.
Do it again.
I think so. I think we do. We need to do
Do
that.
it again.
I feel like we had a very short period of time to do all of these photographs. It was like less than 2 months.
Yeah.
It was closer to a month, like 6 weeks or something, like print and like I think we stopped photographing after 4 weeks.
Yeah.
And then you had to go through them and so we had a very short window and we were invited to go to Aquina and take photos of a lot of people out there and then COVID. So maybe we'll keep going.